What does it take to transform 13 colonies into a nation, lead a revolution against the most powerful empire in the world, and become an immortal legend? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life and each video immerses you in the destiny of those who have shaped the world. Today, prepare to travel back in time and walk in the footsteps of George Washington. From the shores of the Potomac to the fevered deliberations of Philadelphia, from the icy crossing of the Delaware to the building of a capital bearing his name, his rise was marked by bravery, strategy, and unyielding determination. More than a general, more than a president, Washington became a legend, the father of a nation born in fire and hope. But before heading off on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to ensure you don't miss anything. Thank you and enjoy the journey. In the mid-18th century, the Atlantic facade of North America is a vast, fragmented territory divided among different European powers seeking to consolidate their hold on the New World. The 13 British colonies established along the east coast of this continent are one of the main centers of population and development. At this time, they are still officially under the authority of the King of Great Britain and the Parliament in London, but their geographical, economic, and social characteristics increasingly set them apart from the metropolis. To understand the importance of George Washington, the future first president of the United States, 1789-1797, and a key figure in the War of Independence, 1775 through 1783, it is essential to place his journey within this evolving political and strategic context, marked by the rivalry between the British, the French, and the Spanish. If we look at the map of North America in the mid-18th century, we clearly see the British possessions, which stretch from the rocky coasts of New England, in present-day Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, to more southern areas like Georgia. These colonies are not politically unified. Each has its own assembly, governor, local laws, and commercial interests. The disparities are numerous. The northern colonies, more industrialized, focus on fishing, shipbuilding, and maritime trade, while the southern colonies develop vast plantations centered on the cultivation of tobacco, rice, and indigo, often relying on enslaved labor. Despite these differences, they share a growing attachment to certain freedoms and, above all, a desire for expansion into the interior. In parallel, France then controls a vast area that includes New France, centered on the St. Lawrence River, and extends towards the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley. As for Spain, it occupies vast portions of territory further south and west, notably Florida and part of Central America. This complex mesh of possessions leads to incessant frictions over the control of resources and lands, especially as these powers each have alliances or rivalries with local Native American nations. Commercial, diplomatic, and military conflicts are frequent, and the stakes crystallize around the Ohio Valley, where the British and the French seek to extend their influence. For the 13 colonies, westward expansion is crucial in order to acquire fertile territories, develop livestock, find new trade routes, and more broadly, establish a certain prosperity that does not solely depend on the coast. In this climate of tension, each colony tries to negotiate its rights, fiscal privileges, and immigration policies with the British Crown. The mid-18th century is thus marked by a dual dynamic. On one side, the still real anchoring of institutions from England. On the other, an emerging desire for autonomy, fueled by the geographical distance and demographic growth of the colonial population. In the first third of the 18th century, Virginia was one of the oldest British colonies in North America. It was in this province, specifically at Pope's Creek, that George Washington was born on February 22, 1732. At that time, Virginia was deeply part of the 13 colonies under British governance, whose economy relied heavily on tobacco cultivation and the development of vast territories. Pope's Creek, a rural area close to the Potomac River, was the initial living environment of Washington, born into an already well-established family of the local gentry. The Washington family was part of this landowning elite that shaped much of the social and economic landscape of the region. Augustine Washington, George's father, managed several plantations where tobacco, among other crops, was cultivated, a very lucrative crop at that time. As a property owner and member of the colonial gentry, he enjoyed a certain local prestige. Mary Ball Washington, George's mother, was known for her strong character and religious devotion. She worked to instill values of morality, discipline, and diligence in her children, fundamental principles passed down to George from an early age. This strict education would permanently shape his future personality. George Washington's education did not follow a traditional school path, as formal schools were still rare in colonial Virginia. Instead, he received most of his instruction at home, where his tutors and his mother introduced him to reading, writing, and basic mathematics. From a young age, he demonstrated a certain ease in these fundamental disciplines, which would prove crucial for the rest of his life. However, the defining event of his childhood occurred in 1743, when he was only 11, the premature death of his father. This loss disrupted the family organization and the educational and future prospects for George. After the death of Augustine Washington, the eldest sibling, Lawrence, played a major role in the household. He was George's half-brother and benefited from a more advanced education received in England. This difference in education did not prevent Lawrence and George from developing a strong fraternal relationship, with Lawrence even becoming a sort of role model for the young boy. Orphaned of his father, George turned to this guiding figure for advice on matters related to good manners, social life, and the responsibilities that fall upon any direct heir to property. This closeness would shape not only his aspirations, but also the concept he would have of his own family duty. Around the age of 16, George Washington began learning surveying, a highly sought-after skill in the rapidly expanding colonies. Starting in 1748, he joined a team of mapmakers tasked with measuring and delineating lands located west of Virginia. This region, still largely unexplored by British settlers, held considerable development potential. For this young man eager for independence, the discovery of these vast stretches of virgin land truly marked a turning point. Not only did he refine his mathematical skills, but he also became aware of the financial opportunities offered by land ownership, which represented a promising avenue for social advancement at that time. As an apprentice surveyor, Washington was already signing his first official surveys, some of which mapped parcels belonging to wealthy neighboring landowners. This role allowed him to earn an independent income and reinforce his social status. In a Virginia where property formed the cornerstone of wealth and influence, this was a definite advantage. George also developed technical rigor and a keen sense of observation, essential qualities for accurately outlining land boundaries. Through this work, he realized that a good understanding of the territory and its resources opened the way to highly lucrative prospects, provided one relied on discipline and perseverance. Despite his newfound expertise, the financial stability of the Washington family remained fragile. The plantations, though profitable, needed to be managed with care, and competition was fierce in the tobacco market. For George, it quickly became clear that a position within the colonial militia could consolidate his status. At the time, joining the military forces of Virginia meant not only acquiring a regular income, but also gaining social recognition. Competent and respected officers often received land as a reward for their services. Consequently, George began to nurture the hope of enlisting in the militia, seeing in this prospect a concrete way to improve the family's fortune and his prestige. George Washington began his first military career in 1752, at a time when tensions between European powers were intensifying on North American soil. He was then 20 years old, and it was a family event that led him to take his very first official position, the death of his half-brother Lawrence, who was an officer in the Virginia militia. At the time, this militia constituted the backbone of local defense in each British colony. Unlike a regular army composed of full-time soldiers, these regional military formations were generally made up of landowners, farmers, and artisans mobilized to protect their colony in case of conflict or external threat. The officers, often from influential families, were appointed either by the colonial governor or by inheriting family responsibilities, as was the case with Washington. Naturally reserved, yet already driven by a great sense of honor, the young George prepared to assume a budding officer's role, determined to quickly learn the codes of military discipline. During the initial phase of his commitment, Washington became familiar with the demands of military life. Even though the Virginia militia did not require training as rigorous as the regular British Army, the development of defensive strategies, troop coordination, and equipment maintenance were areas where he needed to quickly train. The exercises, often held on the lands or in open spaces around the colonial towns, involved learning to handle a musket, perform marches in formation, and execute basic maneuvers. Obsessed with precision and a sense of duty, Washington immersed himself in reading European military manuals, including tactical treatises from the old continent. He drew from them a certain technical know-how that he gradually adapted to the realities of the American terrain, which was distinguished by its varied relief, dense forests, and the presence of Native American populations allied with or opposed to colonial forces depending on alliances. As Washington takes on his new duties, a major conflict looms between Great Britain and France for control of the Ohio Valley. This rivalry, which has already lasted several decades, reaches unprecedented proportions in the mid-18th century. Both powers, each supported by various indigenous nations, seek to extend their sphere of influence from the Atlantic coast to the great interior rivers. For the British, dominating the Ohio Valley would mean opening new lands for colonization and trade. For the French, present in this region through their fur trading posts and alliances with several Native American communities, it's vital to maintain a network of forts and garrisons along the waterways linking Canada to Louisiana. Anglo-Saxon historians call this conflict the French and Indian War, while in French it is referred to as the Guerre de la Conquête, or War of Conquest. This opposition will stretch from 1754 to 1763. Hostilities on the ground truly begin in 1754, when the governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, decides to send a young George Washington to present an ultimatum to the French forces established at a strategic site. The objective is clear, to signify that these lands, claimed by the British Crown, are off-limits for French occupation. Washington, aware of the mission's difficulty, surrounds himself with scouts and guides familiar with the woods. His journey is fraught with peril. He crosses muddy trails, icy rivers, and forests, where ambushes could spring up at any moment. Politely received but firmly turned away by the French officers, he finds that they are already well established in the area and have no intention of relinquishing their positions. Back in Williamsburg, the colonial capital of Virginia, Washington submits a detailed report on the French military preparations, which alarms the governor. In response, the colony decides to erect its own fort on the present site of Pittsburgh, a project that will quickly clash with opposing forces. In the same year of 1754, Washington finds himself engaged in one of the first direct skirmishes of this budding war. Sent to defend the fort that the Virginians had begun to construct, he learns that the French have already taken and renamed it Fort Duquesne. Determined to maintain a British presence in the region, he has a rudimentary structure built, dubbed Fort Necessity, at the heart of a clearing he thought defensible. On July 3, 1754, French troops and their native allies launch an attack on this modest stronghold. Under a violent thunderstorm, Washington's forces, still inexperienced, are quickly overwhelmed. Lacking shelter and ammunition, the British are forced to surrender. Following confused negotiations, Washington signs a surrender document written in French, of which he does not fully grasp the implications. This act obliges him to acknowledge the British responsibility in the engagement that killed a French officer prior to the battle. This stinging setback marks George Washington's first notable defeat, but also the first major trial that will forge his sense of perseverance. Although this failure is resounding, Washington emerges with a reputation that is contained yet not completely tarnished. In the eyes of colonial authorities, he demonstrated courage by maintaining his defensive lines longer than expected against a far more experienced and numerically superior adversary. For him, this skirmish serves as a concrete lesson. He discovers that British discipline alone is not enough to guarantee victory in unfamiliar terrain. Traditional combat tactics employed in Europe prove poorly suited to dense forests and ambushes conducted by seasoned native warriors. Aware of having underestimated his opponent, Washington improves his observational skills and refines his methods, particularly by more carefully selecting the placement of his positions and learning to better adapt his troops to a hostile environment. In 1755, his military career took a decisive turn when he joined the expedition of British General Edward Braddock. Braddock, sent from England to succeed where colonial militias had failed, had solid command experience. The objective of the expedition was to seize Fort Duquesne, a pivotal point in the Ohio Valley. Washington, serving as a volunteer aide-de-camp, admired Braddock's confidence in the superiority of the regular British Army. However, he was skeptical about the general's overly rigid methods, which neglected the importance of topography and guerrilla tactics. On July 9, 1755, the British expedition suffered a fatal ambush near the Monongahela River. French and Native American gunfire emerged from the dense vegetation, targeting the overly exposed British lines. Chaos ensued, British officers fell under the bullets, and the army became disorganized. General Braddock was mortally wounded during the battle. Amid the general panic, Washington distinguished himself by maintaining a semblance of discipline among the retreating troops. Despite his youth, he managed to organize the retreat, avoiding a complete massacre. This exploit enhanced his prestige, both among the soldiers and through reports sent to the colonial hierarchy. After this aborted expedition, Washington continued to serve in the Virginia militia, notably to protect the western borders of the colony against raids by France's indigenous allies. There were plenty of challenges: recruiting and training volunteers, ensuring logistics for weapons and provisions, and dealing with an unpredictable climate. The men, often scattered across vast territories, struggled to gather in the face of threats. Washington visited these places, inspected the hastily erected rudimentary forts, and ensured that the garrisons had enough gunpowder and supplies. In letters to the colony, he demanded more resources, warning that insufficient defense risked exposing Virginia to repeated incursions. His voice, now taken seriously, testified to the credibility he had gained as an officer concerned with duty and competent in troop organization. Over the years, it became increasingly clear that the war would not be limited to a few sporadic battles in the Ohio Valley. It spread over a vast front from the Canadian border to the Gulf Coast, involving both European troops and numerous indigenous partners. Washington, after several campaigns, began to experience the exhaustion and resource shortages suffered by most colonial officers. When the British engaged their regular regiments in increasing numbers from 1756, the overall strategy changed. Instead of entrusting all operations to local militias, London deployed seasoned officers and a powerful navy to cut off French supplies. Even though Washington might have hoped for advancement within the regular British Army, he remained essentially attached to the Virginia militia, where he did not always receive the necessary funds and support to fulfill his mission. Gradually, the numerous campaigns against the French took their toll on Washington. The western frontier of Virginia, which regularly sent soldiers to confront French garrisons and their indigenous allies, was demanding militarily but also psychologically exhausting. The violence of skirmishes, the difficulty of traveling through dense forests, and the lack of resources sometimes undermined troop morale. Washington himself was fatigued by these years on the front, and around 1758, he decided to gradually withdraw from military life. He returned to Mount Vernon, the family estate he had inherited from his father and consolidated by his half-brother Lawrence before him. This withdrawal coincided with a desire for stability and comfort. The vagaries of war highlighted Washington's need to strengthen his personal situation. A major step in this direction occurred in 1759, when he married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow from an affluent Virginia family. The marriage not only provided him with loyal companionship and moral support, but also increased his wealth through the lands and assets Martha owned. For Washington, acquiring new properties and slaves, though this system was deeply tied to the economies of southern plantations, was then a move to consolidate his finances and influence within the colonial gentry. Back in his plantations, George Washington is working on developing and diversifying the agricultural operation at Mount Vernon. He is concerned with the cultivation of tobacco, the colony's main resource, but also experiments with other productions to improve profitability and reduce his dependency on market fluctuations. These are years of hard work, spent supervising the fields, warehouses, and communications with merchants and intermediaries on the East Coast. He takes advantage of his surveying skills acquired in his adolescence to optimize the management of his lands and to maximize their yield potential. At the same time, he looks after his social position, frequently receiving passing dignitaries, keeping precise accounts of his transactions, and nurturing his network of influence. By 1758, the military situation is gradually shifting in favor of Great Britain. That year, General John Forbes, leading a large British force, manages to bring down Fort Duquesne, which the French abandon and destroy before retreating. Renamed Fort Pitt in honor of British Prime Minister William Pitt, this site will later become the city of Pittsburgh. For Washington, who has fought extensively in these places, it is a relief to see the French influence retreat in the region. The capture of this fort symbolizes the decisive breakthrough of the British in the Ohio Valley. Soon after, exhausted by the fighting, Washington temporarily retires from military life, preferring to focus on repairing his personal finances and managing the Mount Vernon estate he has inherited. Deeply attached to Virginia, he finds it crucial to regain a certain balance, especially since the political and economic future of the colonies is already becoming a concern. He marries Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy woman, in January 1759, thus consolidating his social status. In the mid-18th century, the British victory in this war in North America drastically redraws the map of the continent. The Treaty of Paris in 1763, signed in February of that year, ends the long conflict mainly opposing France and Great Britain for control of colonial territories. France, now weakened, cedes a large part of its North American possessions, like the Ohio Valley and Canada. This seemingly total British triumph, however, comes with an enormous financial cost. The metropolis finds itself with a massive debt and must rethink the management of its colonies in order to avoid further economic difficulties. At this time, the 13 British colonies experience remarkable economic and demographic growth. The colonists, often settled for several generations, consider themselves British subjects enjoying rights similar to those of the metropolis. Although aware of the importance of military protection from London against French or Native American threats, they are not accustomed to being directly taxed by the British Parliament without any form of consultation. Until 1763, the colonies, endowed with their own local assemblies, largely managed their internal affairs. They levied their taxes, handled their laws, and regulated their internal trade without too many external constraints. However, the new fiscal policy of the Crown will quickly trigger a profound dispute. The first notable sign of tension is perceived in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, taken shortly after the Treaty of Paris. Seeking to limit conflicts with the Native American nations living west of the Appalachians, London forbids colonists from expanding beyond a line drawn on the maps, known as the Proclamation Line. In reality, many colonists, among them ambitious landowners or land speculators, were already engaged in acquiring lands in the Ohio Valley. The hopes of thousands of families, dreaming of expanding their agricultural holdings westward, are thus thwarted. George Washington himself, who had considerable surveying experience from his youth, closely monitors these restrictions, judging that they hinder the momentum of development and the opportunity for enrichment for planters like him. The spark that ignites the anger indeed comes from the new taxes imposed by Parliament. Faced with debts incurred during the war, the British government finds it logical that the colonists should participate more massively in the repayment, as the war in America was also waged to protect the colonies. In 1764, the Sugar Act increased taxes on sugar and molasses, essential products for transatlantic trade. Although this law includes several mechanisms to combat smuggling, its stricter enforcement immediately raises protests from merchants and ship owners who become less competitive. The thunderclap occurs the following year, in 1765, with the Stamp Act. This law introduces for the first time a direct tax on legal documents, newspapers, almanacs, and various official forms. Lawyers, printers, innkeepers, and even ordinary colonists are all affected. Very quickly, this new tax crystallizes the protest, as it strikes a largely literate population that regularly uses official papers. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," then emerges, illustrating the categorical refusal to be taxed, by a distant parliament in London without having deputies to defend colonial interests. Protest assemblies are organized in several colonies. By October 1765, a meeting called the Stamp Act Congress is held in New York, bringing together delegates from 9 colonies. Among these representatives, many aim to send a petition to King George III in Parliament to obtain the repeal of the law. Although George Washington is not an exuberant orator, he shares the prevailing indignation, while initially hoping for an amicable solution to be found. Under growing pressure and facing threats of boycotting British products, Parliament eventually repeals the Stamp Act in 1766. However, in the aftermath, the Declaratory Act reasserts that the Crown and Parliament retain the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This assertion of authority reinforces mistrust among the colonists, who understand that, even if specific fiscal measures can be annulled, the principle of London's political grip remains intact. The tensions do not subside. On the contrary, they increase. In 1767, the Townshend Acts impose a series of customs duties on various imports such as lead, glass, paper, paint, and especially tea. The colonists respond with new calls for a boycott, organized through various patriotic associations, some of which take shape under the name of Sons of Liberty. These groups sometimes advocate using direct methods, resorting to intimidation against tax collectors or merchants deemed too compromised. The conflict becomes more politicized when British troops are sent to Boston to restore order, the city being at the heart of active resistance. The pinnacle of hostility in the Massachusetts capital occurs in March 1770, during the event later dubbed the Boston Massacre. After an altercation between soldiers and civilians, 5 city residents are shot by British troops. The tragedy profoundly shocks the colonies. Many newspapers publish dramatic engravings, which galvanize public opinion and fuel the anger towards the British military presence. George Washington, situated in Virginia, follows these events from a distance, witnessing the gradual escalation of a crisis that seems inevitable. For many landowners like him, the limitation of freedoms and the threat of stricter metropolitan control over local affairs become increasingly intolerable. However, Washington remains a measured man. He does not immediately call for a complete break with Great Britain, still hoping for a compromise that would preserve fruitful commercial ties while allowing colonists to retain their rights. In 1773, tensions flared up again when Parliament passed the Tea Act, a law aimed at allowing the British East India Company to sell its tea at a very competitive price, while retaining a tax. To many colonists, this text was seen as an indirect way of maintaining the idea that Parliament could levy taxes in America. Supporters of the boycott responded with spectacular actions. The most famous remains the Boston Tea Party, which occurred on the night of December 16, 1773. Insurgents, some disguised as Native Americans, boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped several consignments of tea into the water. The affair caused a great stir across the Atlantic and profoundly irritated the British authorities. It was an act of defiance that, the Crown believed, required a strong response. In 1774, London responded with the Coercive Acts, a set of laws aimed at punishing Boston and the colony of Massachusetts. Among the measures imposed, the port of Boston was closed until the destroyed tea chests were paid for, and the powers of the Colonial Assembly were severely restricted. The echo of these sanctions resonated throughout all 13 colonies. Even those not directly affected by reprisals considered these laws unjust, fearing that their own local governance might eventually be obliterated. This perceived abuse of British power strengthened intercolonial solidarity. It was in this spirit that the First Continental Congress was convened in Philadelphia in September 1774. Each colony, except Georgia, sent delegates. George Washington was among the representatives from Virginia, one of the most influential and populous colonies. During these sessions, the delegates debated ways to have the British measures lifted and considered, if necessary, the use of force to preserve their rights. While they were not yet demanding formal independence, the congressmen nevertheless adopted a new boycott and drafted a petition addressed to King George III in hopes of reaching a compromise. Washington, though discreet during the debates, distinguished himself as a serious and moderate member. He supported economic resistance, expressed his readiness to engage militarily on behalf of Virginia if it proved inevitable, all while reiterating his initial loyalty to the crown. Many recognized the natural authority he exerted, his solid reputation as a former officer, and his calculated determination. The months that followed only aggravated the situation. The colonists refused to submit to the coercive acts, while the British government sent more troops to maintain order, particularly in the Boston area. The inhabitants then organized militias, and arsenals began forming in anticipation of possible clashes. The first real armed confrontations occurred in the spring of 1775. On April 19th, the battles of Lexington and Concord in present-day Massachusetts triggered what would become the American War of Independence. Hindsight calls the Lexington skirmish the shot heard round the world, marking the final break between colonists now determined to defend their rights with arms and the British power determined to restore its authority. George Washington truly entered history in June 1775, when he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army by the Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia. This institution, composed of representatives from the 13 British colonies, deemed it necessary to unify the nascent war effort under the leadership of a respected leader. Washington was chosen not for his great victories. He had experienced defeats in the past, but rather for his composure, organizational skills, and logistical abilities. His social status especially allowed for rallying the South, while his determination inspired confidence in the North, already in turmoil since the early military engagements. Upon his arrival, Washington inspected the troops, noted their lack of uniforms, rifles, and ammunition, and understood the immense challenge that lay ahead, transforming a disparate militia into an army capable of countering King George III's professional forces. The first major action under his command took place during the Siege of Boston, which began in 1775 and was aimed at driving the entrenched British soldiers out of the city. At this time, the Boston area was at the heart of tensions, especially since the battles of Lexington and Concord a few months earlier. Washington found a Continental Army composed of enthusiastic volunteers, but lacking solid training, discipline, and coordination. Supplies were complicated, as each colony still acted autonomously. However, the commander-in-chief quickly adapted. He imposed gradual training and encouraged the building of rudimentary fortifications on the surrounding heights. Ill-equipped, his soldiers had to be cunning and resourceful. Thanks to the deployment of artillery recovered from Fort Ticonderoga, Washington was ultimately able to seriously threaten the British position. In March 1776, aware that they could no longer withstand these cannons pointed at the city, the British left Boston by sea. This was Washington's first significant strategic victory, marking a crucial departure of royal troops from the region. This episode elevated his prestige among still hesitant patriots. The joy did not last long. After evacuating Boston, the British concentrated their forces on New York, which they considered more geographically central and equipped with an ideal port for landing reinforcements. Washington anticipated this maneuver and mobilized his men to defend the city and its environs. But the military advantages clearly favored the British, who had a powerful fleet and seasoned regular regiments. In the summer of 1776, the fighting in the New York area went poorly for the Continental Army. Defeat on Long Island in August, followed by successive retreats around Manhattan and the northern city. On several occasions, Washington narrowly avoided encirclement. Nevertheless, his tactical skill and caution helped him prevent the total capture of his troops. Understanding that he could not compete head-on with a better-equipped and more numerous army, he chose to preserve his forces to continue the fight. Harassed and demoralized, the Patriot soldiers retreated to Pennsylvania, suffering from the cold and lack of supplies. During these difficult weeks, morale was at its lowest, and some feared the imminent collapse of the rebellion. It was then that Washington conceived a daring counterattack to restore confidence in his troops. On the freezing night of December 25th to 26th, 1776, he organized the crossing of the Delaware River to surprise a garrison of German auxiliaries stationed at Trenton, New Jersey. Deeply asleep after Christmas celebrations, these mercenaries were quickly defeated. A few days later, Washington achieved another success at Princeton, shattering the British sense of invincibility and boosting the morale of the Patriots. This series of raids, though modest in terms of territory, proved decisive for rallying the local population and convincing volunteers to continue their commitment. For many, George Washington became a symbol of tenacity and strategy. He knew he needed to pave the way for psychological victories, even if they were limited in terms of reclaimed ground. Beyond these successes, the Continental Army suffered from severe shortages. Supplies of food, medicine, and clothing were often interrupted due to a lack of money and intercolonial organization. Washington had to appeal to the Continental Congress to gain more resources. But this assembly, limited by the weak powers of the nascent Confederation, struggled to raise the necessarily high funds to sustain a prolonged conflict. Desertions increased as hunger, disease, or despair took hold. Fortunately, a decisive event occurred in 1777 in Saratoga, New York. Even though Washington did not directly command this battle, the American victory over a British army led by General John Burgoyne proved to the world that the Patriots could prevail. This military success led to the signing of the Franco-American Alliance in February 1778. Louis XVI, King of France, saw it as an opportunity to diminish Britain's power by directly supporting the American rebels. French aid, both financial and naval, was crucial. It soon transformed an isolated colonial uprising into an international war in which France and later Spain engaged against Great Britain. However, before fully benefiting from this new alliance, Washington's army is put to the test during the winter of 1777-1778, spent at the Valley Forge camp not far from Philadelphia. The conditions there are terrible. Cold, malnutrition, and disease decimate the troops. As Christmas 1777 approaches, the situation is so dire that many think of abandoning the independence cause. Yet Washington, despite strong moral pressure, maintains unity through his leadership qualities. He obtains additional funds from Congress and manages to establish a methodical training. The arrival of Prussian officer Friedrich von Steuben in February 1778 is crucial. With strict methods, he teaches discipline, effective bayonet use, and the organization of executing orders. This rigor, almost non-existent until then, gives rise to a more homogeneous and professional force. soldiers learned to maneuver and fight like a true regular army, becoming significantly more formidable. As the months pass, and the melting snow signals the return of military campaigns, the Continental Army is transformed. As the year 1778 progresses, French support strengthens. Officers and equipment land in the United States, offering new tactical perspectives. On the Atlantic Ocean, French warships complement the young American fleet and try to contain British maritime superiority. On the ground, Washington must nonetheless keep his army mobilized and demonstrate endurance. The British still launch offensives in the South, hoping to rally loyalists and cut American supply routes. But the overall strategy changes. The war suddenly takes on a broader dimension as France, then Spain from 1779, force London to disperse its forces. Washington perceives this scattering of enemy troops as an opportunity. He coordinates his efforts with the French allies and promotes the arrival of new contingents ready to join the fight. The decisive turn comes in 1781 during the Yorktown campaign in Virginia. British General Charles Cornwallis, tasked with consolidating King George III's grip in the South, establishes himself on the Yorktown Peninsula, counting on the Royal Navy for support. Washington, aided by the Count of Rochambeau and the French fleet, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, sets a trap. The Franco-American land forces surround Cornwallis, while the French Navy closes the sea route and prevents any British evacuation by sea. From September 28 to October 19, 1781, successive sieges and bombardments forced Cornwallis to surrender. It is a fundamental moment. In the eyes of the world, Great Britain, despite its power, suffers a humiliating defeat. For Washington, it is the culmination of 6 years of relentless effort, during which he often feared the collapse of the insurrection. After the shock of Yorktown, most armed violence in the colonies gradually ceases, although some skirmishes continue. Peace negotiations open in Paris, France, where American and British diplomats seek an official agreement. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed, endorsing the recognition of the independence of the United States of America by Great Britain. The new nation is born, and George Washington, who led the Continental Army throughout the War of Independence, thus completes his role as a triumphant military leader. His constant leadership, forged in difficulty and illustrated by strategic victories, remains at the heart of the American legend. He managed to unite soldiers from different colonies, overcome internal rivalries, handle severe setbacks, and, above all, maintain the ideal of freedom when all seemed lost. His command during these 8 years of war paved the way for the foundations of a federal state built to last. Armed with these military successes and the vital alliance with France, Washington emerges from this conflict determined to support the budding republic, hoping that his sacrifices and those of his men mark the beginning of a new era. In December 1783, after 8 years of fierce conflict, George Washington returned to Mount Vernon, his plantation in Virginia. He had just relinquished his military command, a surprising choice for a victorious general. This gesture reflected his deep attachment to Republican ideals. The British had recognized the independence of the 13 states, and Washington hoped to enjoy a peaceful life, dedicated to his land and family. However, his reputation as an honest and patriotic leader rendered him an essential figure. The nation in Reconstruction saw him as a potential guide to stabilize the young country. Soon, the Confederation, established by the Articles of Confederation, revealed its weaknesses. The Continental Congress, lacking real fiscal powers, struggled to repay war debt and maintain armed forces. The states, jealous of their autonomy, erected trade barriers one after another and disputed over borders. The absence of an effective central power jeopardized national stability. Washington, witnessing these dysfunctions, feared that the Union might disintegrate before it could consolidate its independence. He stressed in his private correspondences the urgency of revising this inoperative system. The crisis worsened with the outbreak of Shays' Rebellion in 1786 in Massachusetts. Farmers, burdened by debt, rose up to protest against the seizure of their goods. Washington, even without participating, understood the danger. Without strong federal authority, the states risked falling into anarchy. Local leaders then called for a convention to overhaul the Articles of Confederation. Initially reluctant, Washington gradually realized that his prestige could help find a national consensus. He feared the young republic would collapse if nothing was done. In May 1787, delegates from nearly all the states gathered in Philadelphia. The objective, to conceive a government capable of safeguarding the Union while respecting the sovereignty of the states. Upon his arrival, Washington was immediately elected president of the convention, a sign of the unanimous trust he inspired. His presence, discreet yet imposing, provided essential credibility to the debates. The discussions, sometimes animated, focused on proportional representation, executive powers, and overall balance. Washington, keen to curb any tyrannical drift, remained aware that a weak executive could not prevent the country's dissolution. The debates resulted in an innovative text. It established a bicameral legislature, the House of Representatives, proportional to the population, and the Senate, offering each state equal representation. The president, elected for a limited term, would exercise powers circumscribed by checks and balances. Washington supported these principles, which, according to him, prevented the creation of an abuse of authority while equipping the government with means of action. In September 1787, the convention adopted the draft constitution and submitted it to the states for ratification. Washington, while standing back, embodied the balance sought. The Constitution came into effect on March 4, 1789, marking the beginning of the federal government of the United States under this new legal framework. It remains today the oldest written constitution still in force in the world. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of essays called the Federalist Papers to convince the skeptics. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, feared the grip of a centralizing elite and the loss of individual rights. Washington did not officially write in the press, but his name symbolized unity and reliability. Gradually, a consensus was reached. The Constitution went into effect when 9 states ratified it in June 1788. However, to ensure broad adherence, the delegates promised to add amendments explicitly protecting the fundamental liberties of citizens. By the spring of 1789, the political machinery was set in motion. Local elections were organized to appoint the members of the First Congress and the electors responsible for choosing the president. For many, one candidate stood out, George Washington. His integrity, moderation, and sense of duty placed him in the position of an indispensable figure. Upon the announcement of the results, he won unanimously, a rare occurrence in world political history. Washington, who had harbored a desire for permanent retirement, found himself once again called to serve the Republic. On April 30th, 1789, it was on the balcony of the Federal Hall in New York that Washington took the oath as the first president of the United States. The crowd, gathered for this event, hailed him as the architect of the revolutionary victory and the embodiment of a Republican model. In his inaugural speech, he expressed his humility and determination to defend the Constitution, which he had helped to ratify. This ceremony marked a historic turning point. The young nation, freed from the constraints of a too-weak confederation, entered a new era where federal power, balanced by several institutions, had to consolidate the Union and guarantee the rights of each individual. From the moment he was inaugurated, Washington dedicated himself to organizing the federal government. Although there were articles of the Constitution that specified the essential functions of the executive power, many details remained to be defined. One of his first tasks was to surround himself with competent advisors, who would later form what would be known as the presidential cabinet. For the first time in the young country's history, a president structured his team to cover key areas: foreign policy, financial management, and defense. Washington paid particular attention to selecting people whose loyalty and ability to handle public responsibilities he trusted. He thus appointed Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. Jefferson, a native of Virginia and principal author of the Declaration of Independence of 1776, was seen as a skilled diplomat and man of letters. His role was crucial in conducting international relations, especially as the United States, still a fragile power, had to deal with well-established European monarchies. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, was given the position of Secretary of the Treasury. A former aide-de-camp to Washington during the War of Independence, Hamilton distinguished himself by his talent in finance and organization. He would quickly establish himself as one of the main architects of the country's economic policy. Finally, Henry Knox, who had already served Washington during the conflict against Great Britain, became Secretary of War. His mission was to oversee the fledgling defense of the United States, particularly because the young nation still needed to secure its borders and assert its authority against neighboring powers. In parallel to setting up the cabinet, Washington and Congress worked on passing the first fundamental laws. Among them, the Judiciary Act of 1789 created the structure of the federal judiciary system. This text established the Supreme Court, the highest judicial authority, and provided for the establishment of district courts and courts of appeals. The independence of the judicial branch appeared to Washington as an indispensable pillar to enforce the Constitution and ensure uniform justice, especially in a territory as vast and diverse as the United States at the end of the 18th century. The appointment of John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court completed this setup and gave a precise face to the authority played by the federal judicial power. On the economic and political front, the most urgent challenge for this new administration was to consolidate the financial stability of the country. At that time, the United States inherited a heavy war debt incurred during the conflict against Great Britain. Alexander Hamilton, in charge of the Treasury, then proposed an ambitious plan. He intended not only to take on the federal debt, but also the debts of the various states to strengthen the national credit. This approach, known as the Debt Assumption Plan, sparked passionate debates, as some believed it favored states with more debt and overstepped the prerogatives of the central government. Nevertheless, Hamilton convinced a majority of congressmen by emphasizing the necessity for the United States to establish a solid reputation among foreign creditors. Alongside debt management, Hamilton advocates for the creation of a national banking institution, the Bank of the United States. Founded in 1791, it is designed to issue a unified currency, facilitate loans to the government, and boost domestic trade. At the time, this idea is innovative, but it encounters opposition from political figures like Thomas Jefferson, who see it as too broad an interpretation of federal powers as outlined by the Constitution. Despite these controversies, Washington supports Hamilton, believing that a strong economic foundation is essential for the nation's future. These debates herald the birth of different political currents: the Federalists around Hamilton, who are in favor of a strong government, and the Democratic Republicans around Jefferson, who advocate limiting federal action in favor of the states. In 1790, the young and divided United States seeks a neutral federal capital, far from the influences of powerful states like New York or Philadelphia. George Washington, the first president, chooses a strategic location on the banks of the Potomac, between the North and the South, ensuring political balance. But the city is just a plan. It needs to be built. For 10 years, the government remains in Philadelphia, while Washington, D.C. takes shape. In 1800, finally, the capital is established in this new city, designed to embody the unity and ambition of a nation in progress. In 1792, as Washington's presidency comes to an end, the question of a second term immediately arises. The electors, aware of his international stature and popularity among the people, place him back in power by unanimous vote of the Electoral College. This crucial re-election cements his moral authority and highlights the conspicuous absence of any political rival capable of competing with him. During this second term, a strategic question dominates foreign policy. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, is radicalizing in Europe and dividing American opinion. Many citizens regard France as the partner that helped the colonies during the War of Independence. On the other hand, others are wary of the violent turn of events in Paris. Aware that the country is still fragile, Washington signs the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, emphasizing the necessity for the United States not to side militarily with revolutionary France or Great Britain. This decision arouses the displeasure of those who see hesitancy towards France as a betrayal. But Washington is convinced that the young nation cannot afford another costly war. It is a pragmatic choice, even though it creates very strong internal political tensions. The challenges are not limited to European geopolitics. The executive power must also manage internal uprisings threatening federal authority. The most striking example is the Whiskey Rebellion, which erupts in 1794 in Pennsylvania. At that time, the government imposed a tax on alcohol production, particularly on whiskey. Small distillers, often interior farmers, feel aggrieved by this measure, which they consider excessive and unjust. Protests quickly turn into violence, and Washington responds firmly. He mobilizes nearly 13,000 militiamen and personally directs from the region the maneuver to repress it in order to enforce federal law. In the eyes of the world, this reaction is a decisive test. It is about showing that the national government has the authority to enforce its decisions, even in remote rural areas. On the diplomatic front, Washington also needs to resolve ongoing tensions with Great Britain, the former colonial power. Commercial and border conflicts continue to undermine the relationship between the two countries. To ease the situation, John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, is sent to London to negotiate an agreement. The Jay Treaty, signed in 1794, helps avoid an open military confrontation and clarifies several disputes, including the withdrawal of British forts from certain American territories. Despite this, the agreement fails to satisfy everyone. Supporters of a closer alliance with France see it as a betrayal of moral commitments to a friendly country and feel that Britain comes out ahead. Washington, as a pragmatic man, believes it is preferable to maintain peace and economic stability during a period when the denunciation of the treaties could have plunged the nation into a new conflict. At the end of his second term, Washington made a surprising decision for many of his contemporaries. He refused to seek a third term. In a young republic without ingrained political traditions, voices were encouraging him to remain in power or even to maintain it indefinitely. However, Washington, true to his convictions, believed that a change at the executive head was beneficial for the political system. His choice thus offered an essential precedent for the American presidency, that of a peaceful and voluntary transition to another executive leader without pressure or machination. Before leaving office, he published a farewell address in 1796, the warnings of which resonated for decades in American political life. In this address, he urged his fellow citizens to guard against the formation of antagonistic political parties, which he foresaw as seeds of division and internal conflict. He also warned against prolonged foreign alliances, emphasizing that the United States should remain cautious in its foreign policy and never blindly engage in wars or treaties that could compromise their sovereignty. This speech demonstrated Washington's desire to forge a nation free from any tutelage, cautious on the world stage, and concerned with its internal unity. In March 1797, George Washington officially left his position as President of the United States, which he had held for 2 consecutive terms since 1789. At the age of 65, he returned to his estate in Mount Vernon, Virginia, with the hope of finding a quieter life and dedicating himself once again to his greatest passion, agriculture. Mount Vernon, a vast property overlooking the Potomac River, consists of a main manor and numerous outbuildings intended for agricultural production, livestock, and storage of crops. This plantation is the result of years of successive developments, initiated from his early age and completed during his rare periods of rest during the War of Independence. Now, Washington wished to settle there permanently and fully devote himself to managing his lands. Despite his need for tranquility, the former head of state remained an unavoidable public figure. His fellow citizens, aware of his status as a national hero and first president, continued to seek his help or advice, whether to resolve commercial disputes or to establish plans for the country's future organization. Although he aspired to discretion, Washington remained deeply attached to the solidity of the republic and was available for any advice that could help preserve his political legacy. Hence, he maintained a sustained correspondence with both former officers and emerging politicians to share his experience and reflections on the issues facing the young nation. Over the months following his return, Washington dedicated himself to restoring and expanding certain parts of Mount Vernon. His primary objective was to diversify crops, introduce new soil rotation techniques, and improve overall productivity. Known for his methodical mind, he scrupulously recorded yields, temperatures, and weather conditions to refine his agricultural approach. This rigor, inherited from his initial training as a surveyor and his military experiences, was reflected in the meticulous organization of his plantations, where each field was mapped and each harvest evaluated. He also sought to modernize the infrastructures, using his network of contacts to import more efficient tools from Europe. In parallel, Washington ensured the maintenance of the main manor, wishing to make it a welcoming place not only for his family, but also for the many visitors who inevitably presented themselves, whether they be political figures, diplomats, or longtime friends. The gardens, designed to be both functional and aesthetic, incorporated a variety of ornamental plants and fruit trees. This commitment to developing Mount Vernon was not only driven by a desire to improve his personal estate, but also by the will to illustrate a model of agricultural success for the young nation. Washington believed that a flourishing agriculture was an indispensable pillar for economic independence and the political stability of the United States. Although his official withdrawal from public life, Washington cannot escape the national and international issues that crossed the late 18th century. The second president, John Adams, regularly seeks the advice of his predecessor, aware that Washington's prestige and popularity remain assets for guiding public opinion or easing divisions. Although he no longer participates in legislative assemblies or the fervent debates sparked by foreign or fiscal policy, he remains a respected interlocutor. This discreet yet real presence testifies to his continued commitment to the Republic, whose foundations he ardently wishes to perpetuate, established during his tenure. In December 1799, as winter settles in Virginia, George Washington's health suddenly deteriorates. After spending a cold day inspecting his lands in the rain, he contracts what seems to be a severe sore throat. Doctors sent to his bedside, according to the practices of the time, resort to bloodletting and usual remedies, but the situation does not improve favorably. On December 14, 1799, Washington passes away in his room at Mount Vernon. He is 67 years old at the time. The official cause of death remains debated by historians, but it is generally attributed to an acute throat infection, possibly laryngitis or epiglottitis, worsened by the rudimentary medical treatments of the 18th century. The news of his passing arouses deep emotion throughout the original 13 states, as well as in newly integrated territories of the Union. Spontaneous tributes pour in, ceremonies, speeches, and processions are organized in his honor. Congress decrees a national mourning, and many foreign personalities, notably in Europe, express their respect for the first American president. His image, already crowned by the military victory of the War of Independence, is now associated with the dignity of a man who refused to exercise power for life. In the months that follow, Washington's widow, Martha, receives numerous expressions of sympathy, while the memory of the father of the nation spreads beyond American borders. Thus ends the life of George Washington, but his legacy, engraved in history, transcends the boundaries of time. A founding father, unwavering visionary, he forged a nation and inspired generations in pursuit of freedom. His example still resonates, like a beacon illuminating the path for people's yearning for autonomy and greatness.